F1's 2026 rules haven't even been made official yet, and already extensive changes are needed to address the biggest fears raised by teams. Most back the basic objectives to make the cars lighter and more nimble, improve racing, and balance a very different hybrid engine with completely different car downforce and drag levels. But the concern is that what's been outlined is simply not achievable with the rules in their current form. And remember, teams have seen the draft regulations, so know a lot more of the detail than the outline that has been shared publicly so far. Those draft regulations were presented to the World Motorsport Council earlier in June, and there'll be an e-vote before the end of the month, so the first version of the rules can be formally approved. That does not give a lot of time to make the changes the teams seek, and it will probably take months to address this properly. To understand what's causing so much controversy, let's explore the biggest concerns that have been raised. The 2026 car's performance profile will be dramatically different from now, with a 55% reduction in drag targeted. F1 will also be abandoning the drag reduction system as we know it in favour of active aerodynamics that will open the front and rear wings significantly on the straights. And any driver will be allowed to use this on any straight regardless of whether they are close to another car. This is all because of what's needed to drive the required energy recovery and charge the battery. As the V6 is going to have a reduced output in 2026, the cars need to be lower drag to achieve similar speed profiles to now. But the fear is this risks going too far. Grand Prix Drivers Association Director George Russell has warned it has significant safety implications, and teams worry the cars will simply be too fast on the straights. The FIA admits that top speeds will be slightly higher than now, but insists it will be closely monitored to avoid it running out of control, with restrictions on when the low drag mode can be used and the deployment of electrical power if needed. The intention is for straight line speeds to be comparable to now, plus or minus a couple miles per hour. It's not like the 2026 cars are going to be 1.5 times faster on the straights or anything quite so outrageous, but the lap time will be biased more towards the straights, given there is also going to be a 30% reduction in downforce for these cars, and the FIA is unapologetic about this. The desire now is to slow the cars down in the corners while making them more nimble, so they won't be as quick, but they'll change direction better, aren't as lazy to drive, and by extension can be raced better. But with the ground effect being reduced by changes to the floor, rear wing and diffuser, teams are worried that the car simply won't have the grip required in the corners. FIA single-seater technical director Jan Monchaux said the FIA is happy to discuss what an adequate downforce level would be once teams mature their designs and simulation work with an initial set of confirmed regulations. That means evolving the rules, most likely in the floor area, to add more downforce to the cars than what is currently outlined. The minimum weight of the cars will drop by 30 kilograms in 2026, and it's easy enough to write a reduction from 798 to 768 kilos into the regulations, but teams are concerned it won't be possible to get there or even get close. It's important to note that it's a minimum weight, not a mandatory target to hit. But with excess weight costing performance from 0.3 to 0.4 seconds per lap per 10 kilograms, it's going to be a key objective. Aston Martin driver Fernando Alonso thinks it's probably impossible to achieve a 30 kilo reduction, especially given the weight added in the engine area. And even if it is achievable, this weight reduction could prove massively expensive. As Williams team principal James Vowles says, it's not a fun thing to do. The FIA describes this target as challenging but feasible and is determined to cut the weight. And it is a laudable objective given the dramatic increases over the past 15 years. One thing that has already been clarified is that the driver minimum weight rule, first introduced in 2019 that means seat ballast equalises them at 80 kilos, will be retained. There was a bit of uncertainty about this after one team suggested it had been removed from a draft set of rules. But this will exist, and it will actually be raised to 82 kilos in 2026. That is a good decision, but the car weight limit argument is set to run and run. There are legitimate concerns that the chassis rules are having to do too much to compensate for the limitations of the power unit package. McLaren team principal Andreas Stella points to the limitations of the 50-50 split between conventional V6 and electrical power that's central to the regulations, at least with how it's currently achieved. The FIA is at least open to the possibility of adjusting this. While the power unit regulations were first published back in August 2022 and the engine manufacturers are well advanced in terms of design and development work, there is potentially scope for change. When we asked FIA single-seater director Nicholas Tombassis about this, the response was that the governance does allow tweaks to be made with sufficient support from the manufacturers. The argument is that there doesn't necessarily have to be a super strict adherence to the 50-50 concept in all conditions. As Stellar explains, the concern is that there will not be sufficient energy if this is stuck to across the board. This means there's potential for adjusting the amount of energy deployed at a given time, thus changing the ratio. There's also the possibility of raising the fuel flow limit to allow more power to be generated by the V6. These would be subtle but significant changes that wouldn't require fundamental alterations to the engines but could make them easier to use. But at least one of the manufacturers is not keen on this. As Mercedes team principal Toto Wolff says, while the governance could allow for changes, realistically that ship has sailed. This has all the ingredients of a classic Mercedes versus Red Bull battle, as when Christian Horner was asked about this possibility, he mentioned that there's always one that doesn't want to change. The increase in active aerodynamics in 2026 is the most eye-catching aspect of the regulations. We know that there will be an X mode to slash the drag on the straights and a Z mode for downforce in the corners, and drivers will be switching between them. But the exact way all of this will work isn't yet fully defined. The FIA does have a broad idea of the basics, which Monchaux explained when asked about it by us in a press conference in Canada. He characterised it as similar to the current DRS. So that means there will be conditions that have to be met to deploy low drag X mode. That's not strictly about proximity to a car in front, but ensuring the car is in or close to a straight line, by the necessity for very low or zero lateral load. The FIA is explicitly clear that this will be driver activated rather than automated, and has also promised a rigorous approach on safety similar to the one taken with the DRS. The key details that need to be finalised are the exact configuration of the front and rear wing adjustments, and conditions such as when X mode must be deactivated ahead of a corner. That will be significant in order to allow the necessary time for the airflow to reattach when in Z mode form. The tyres will get smaller in 2026, yet the FIA's outline claims this will mean a minimal loss in grip. The question is whether it will be that trivial. The wheel rim size remains at 18 inches, but the tyres are narrower to reduce drag. The tyres will be 2.5cm or 8.2% narrower at the front, with a reduction of 3cm or 7.4% at the rear. There will also be a slight reduction in diameter from the current 72cm to somewhere between 70.5 and 71. On top of that, Pirelli needs to understand the impact on the tyres of the switch between the low drag X mode and the high downforce Z mode, which Pirelli Motorsport director Mario Isola describes as a challenge. The first test of the 2026 prototype tyres will be in September this year, but how Pirelli can simulate the performance profile and load characteristics of the active aero cars with existing machinery is still up in the air, especially as the reduction in aerodynamic performance means there will be more emphasis than before on mechanical grip, which includes from the tyres. One of the consequences of all these performance factors is that there will not just be a mismatch in the cornering and straight line speeds of the 2026 cars, but the overall outcome will be a significant net performance loss. In other words, how much faster the cars are on the straights won't mean as much lap time gained as what is lost in the corners. One worry is that this risks reducing F1's lap time advantage over the Formula 2 feeder series to as small as a few seconds, which would also leave F1 vulnerable to being surpassed by other top-level series in terms of pure performance. Given one of F1's calling cards is being the pinnacle of motorsport, this is significant. Tombazis actually called those fears accurate based on a snapshot of the draft regulations, but believes that as things evolve, this will be 100% resolved. The FIA is confident there will be clear steps in performance from this point of the regulations, and openly admits it set the bar reasonably low so that the teams can have a say in where the rules are changed. Tombazis reckons it will be easy to increase the downforce of these cars with regulatory freedom, so it's probably just a matter of deciding how to get more performance from a floor that's set to be narrower and flatter than now, or avoid devaluing the diffuser as much as is intended in the draft rules. F1 is a complicated business, and that's arguably one of its appeals. But there are concerns that 2026 might just get a little bit too confusing to follow. After all, there's all sorts of new terms to get used to, with X mode, Z mode and manual override being added to the vernacular on top of the well-established terminology and jargon related to hybrid engines. The question is whether that will make F1 less accessible to casual fans. The FIA argues not. When it comes to encouraging young fans, Monchaux points to their aptitude for manipulating smartphones as proof they can cope with it. While that might accidentally come across a bit more patronising than intended, you at least understand the point he's making. Tombazis accepted that F1 will get a smidgen more complicated, but it is not the proverbial rocket science. That may be true, but there is a lot to be said for coming up with accessible and clear terminology to avoid confusion. The effect of this can only be judged in 2026, but it will be well worth the FIA and F1 giving serious consideration to how this is all badged and presented to the millions watching. Another aspect to consider, potentially even more importantly, is that the greater emphasis on energy management to race strategy will probably merit some explaining during races. F1's already dabbled with making more energy-related data available during the broadcast, and a bit more of that would go a long way to ensuring that viewers get the information they need to understand how a more energy-dependent battle is really evolving come 2026. One of the pressure points is an end of June deadline to approve significant parts of the technical and sporting regulations to adhere to the FIA International Sporting Code about how far before a season major rule items need to be published. Once these rules exist though, as we've mentioned, changes can be made as long as there is significant agreement among the teams and other stakeholders. As there are likely differing opinions on various subjects, in an ideal world the regulations would be fully formed with a final compromise reached before ever getting published. But that's not realistic, has never happened and will never happen. So while the teams would like more action to be taken before the World Motorsport Council rubber stamps the first issue of these rules by the end of June, the FIA's intention is for them to be published in their most restrictive form and then be opened up later. The logic is that it will be far easier in the next months to start increasing the freedom and change aspects of the regulations that are causing specific problems the teams dislike than the other way around. That's based on assuming the teams will all agree on more freedom and fixes that suit them, whereas if the FIA tried to rein the rules back in from a kinder starting point, there would be more pushback and it would be harder to get changes agreed. Tom Bassis hopes that between the end of June and the start of 2025, which is when teams are allowed to start aerodynamic development work on their 2026 cars, the refinements to the rules will all be approved. But even that doesn't leave a lot of time to get this done, given how long the list of issues seems to be.